All right, so welcome to today's webinar, Unpacking the Omnibus Package. Last week, the European Commission unveiled the first and second Omnibus packages. And in today's webinar, we want to dive a bit deeper on what these proposed changes mean for your compliance efforts. Before we get started, a few logistical points. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share both the recording and the slides we have prepared for you after the webinar in the response email. You also have a Q&A section in the webinar, which you can use to ask questions you might have already during the webinar. We will also have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. I'm joined today by two colleagues, I would say, webinar colleagues, not the first time. That is Sebastian Rünz. Maybe Sebastian, you can quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Harald. My name is Sebastian Rünz. I'm a lawyer at Taylor Wessing and advise companies a lot on supply chain compliance.
And very glad to be joined again by Greta Koch, policy advisor for Axel Voss in the European Parliament. Greta, maybe you can also quickly introduce yourself.
Yes, sure. Thanks for having me again. I'm Greta Koch, and I'm the assistant of Axel Voss, who's an EPP member of the European Parliament. And he used to be the shadow rapporteur for the due diligence directive, which is why I was invited before to talk about the due diligence changes. And now we're back with the changes of the omnibus to due diligence. And Axel Voss is still the coordinator for the responsible committee, which is why we're still trying to have it on the lookout.
Great to have you, Greta and Sebastian. So let's look at today's agenda. It's quite a packed agenda. We will start out with a quick introduction. In fact, we are already in the middle of it. We will then move on to having a look at the omnibus packages 1 and 2, but also the third one, which is lined up, but also look at the timelines and scope changes that have now been proposed with these 2 omnibus packages last week. And then afterwards, we will dive into the respective legislations, looking first at CBAM and taxonomy, and then subsequently CSRD. These are the first ones we look at because these are also the ones which are already in force and companies are already working with them. And then afterwards, we will go to the CSDDD, dive a bit deeper on the changes, particularly on the changes to the risk assessment when it comes to the value chain or chain of activities in scope and other topics. And then at the end, as promised, the Q&A. So starting out, and this is part of the introduction still, what are the goals or the principles of today's webinar? First of all, our goal is to go beyond the bullet points, so go a bit deeper on the analysis than just the headlines you so often read on LinkedIn. Not that they're bad, but I think the purpose of this webinar is to go one step deeper. We also want to reflect for each change on the practical implications of the change. And actually, you will see for each of the changes, we have introduced a rating system from far-reaching change red to minor change green, which we will then use to reflect on how we interpret the practical implications of each of those changes. And then last but not least, we also want to spend some time connecting the dots. Why connecting the dots? Because the legislations, particularly the CSRD, CSDDD, and taxonomy, are really an integrated system of legislations. The CSRD is the reporting framework for the CSDDD. The CSRD and CSDDD connect heavily when it comes to the double materiality assessment, where particularly the impact materiality side, any kind of due diligence, so working with potential and actual adverse impacts informs the materiality assessment, but also, of course, reporting then on the prioritized actions and impacts identified into the CSRD is an important integration between the two. But also the EU Taxonomy links, for instance, with the CSRD. That's something we will talk about. So the requirements to report on taxonomy information in the CSRD and the CSDDD informing and assessing the taxonomy alignment. So really an integrated system, and we will refer back to some of these integrations during the webinar. So now let's have a bit of a look at the omnibus packages, and yeah, maybe Greta, you can start giving us a bit of an overview. What was actually proposed last week, and which topics were covered by Omnibus 1 and 2, and what is the road ahead now, particularly for Omnibus 1 and 2?
Yes, sure. So overall, of course, the Commission has proposed an omnibus legislation, or has announced an omnibus legislation already quite some months ago. I think it was a bit unexpected that it would happen so quickly, to be honest, because it touches on the major frameworks when it comes to sustainability reporting. So this first omnibus touches upon changes that, first of all, have a so-called stop the clock approach, which means that while we try to reduce the administrative burden of the omnibus of several pieces of legislation, companies do no longer have to report in the time frame that was originally set out. And this is particularly important for the CSRD and the CSDDD, but there are also far-reaching changes of the text of the CSRD and of the CSDDD. There are changes to a delegated act of the taxonomy, and there are also changes to CBAM. So this is what the Omnibus 1 represents. Later on, we will have an Omnibus 2, which is about investment simplification, and then also another Omnibus package regarding the so-called mid-caps. So this is about a specific category of company size. And the Commission has also announced that these 3 omnibuses are the first steps of many. So we can expect that throughout the mandate of the Commission, which is still to last a couple of more years, that more omnibus packages like this will be announced, because this is overall an effort to simplify legislation that came out that has not been very coherent, or that has not been adjusted according to overlaps. And so this is a simplification effort that the Commission has announced. When we look at the road ahead, there are several things that might happen. The first thing is that this so-called stop the clock exercise can happen first, which is to to kind of freeze certain efforts like the CSRD and the CSDDD for 1 or 2 years, so that the timelines are being moved. This is something that shouldn't be very difficult to negotiate. This is also something that will probably happen under a so-called fast-track procedure. So this is something that we will see happening quite soon. But of course, any content changes to the CSRD and the CSDDD might take some time. There are no specific deadlines in mind, so we have to see how politically this plays out and when this will actually take effect.
Mm-hmm. And Greta, there are actually already some questions coming on the topic, and of course that's something that also concerns many of our customers. The deforestation regulation, the battery regulation, forced labor regulation, there are many other regulations which have this due diligence component to them. Is there any clarity or any view on whether those might still be changed also as part of these, let's say, simplification approaches?
Currently, I do not expect any changes there. This has not been part of an announcement. There was no communication from the Commission anywhere that this would be included. They have communicated that they wanted to change the CSRD, CSDDD, and the taxonomy as the overarching frameworks. And then later on was CBAM. CBAM was kind of added into the mix, but there was never any discussion whether further sectoral approaches should also be included. This is just something that kind of from the EPP side, and particularly my MEP, so Axel Voss, has asked for, that there should also be a simplification effort when it comes to sector-specific standards, or not sector-specific standards, but sector-specific legislation, because of course there are overlaps, there are supply chain aspects to it, there are reporting aspects to it. So I think that some alignment would have made sense, but currently the Commission has not communicated anything in that direction.
All right, and since we talked so much about timelines, I think timelines, let's exactly look at those. Sebastian, can you tell us about the timeline for CSRD and how things are changing with the omnibus?
Yeah. So we have to distinguish. Under the CSRD, there was a first wave of companies that were already obliged to report under the NFRD. For those companies, there is not going to change anything with the omnibus. So they are still obliged in 2025 to report for the financial year 2024. But then we have two other waves, companies that reached the threshold of the existing CSRD, 250 employees or 50 employees, and were obliged in 2026 to report on 2025, or obliged in 2027 to report on 2026. Those companies with the new thresholds are only obliged to report in 2028 now with the omnibus. So we have a postponement of 2 years. This reporting obligation only applies to companies with 1,000 employees and 50 million turnover or 25 million balance sheet. So we have a much wider threshold. We will take a look on the next slide on how many companies now are only affected by the CSRD. It's definitely much less. That is the timeline of the CSRD. And of course, now the $1 million question is, what should I do if I fall under the CSRD in 2026 or 2027 and already started to prepare compliance with CSRD? And that's very frustrating, of course, for a lot of companies, because it's uncertain whether the omnibus will be coming. There are some countries that already implemented the directive, but still, if the omnibus is coming, then this directives already transformed into national laws will be changed again. So the answer is difficult. From our perspective, I would be reluctant to spend a lot of money on implementation efforts if it's unclear whether I fall under the new scope or not. You really have to ask yourself the question whether it's probably a strategic opportunity for your company. Then it makes sense to continue with the preparation. If it's just a burden, something that you have to do, maybe your decision will be differently. Also, if you just reach the threshold of the existing CSRD, for example, 250 employees, is pretty sure that there will be a higher threshold. So it's likely that you will not fall under the scope. If you are just below the 1,000, maybe there will be some changes, but those questions are just random questions you could ask yourself. In the end, it's not 100% clear whether it comes as it is envisaged right now, but it is very likely. So spending a lot of effort and time right now, especially for the wave 2 and wave 3 companies, I would at least question that approach.
Mm-hmm.
CSDDD, the timeline is a little bit easier. So what was in the CSDDD so far was a 3-phased approach. The first companies falling under the CSDDD in 2027, then 2028, 2029. Now we have an application as of 2028 only, so a postponement of 1 year. Which means we have just 2 phases. The first phase, 2028, for companies with more than 3,000 employees and 900 million turnover. And then in 2029, the second phase with companies for companies with more than 1,000 employees and 450 million turnover.
Mm-hmm. So let's have a look at what that means. And Sebastian already alluded to it. In terms of companies in scope. So these numbers are not precise. Some of them are from the press release and the respective EU sites. On CBAM, for instance, the scope reduction is largest due to the change in what's called the de minimis threshold from 150 euros to 50 tons. So change here in the threshold, which reduces the amount of companies in scope by 90%. On CSRD, we see an 80% reduction of companies in scope. CSDDD does not change. These 7,000 include both the EU and non-EU companies because the thresholds did not change, simply the timing or the transposition changed from 2027 to 2028. So after having looked at the timelines and scopes, we now look at CBAM and taxonomy changes to get started. Sebastian.
Yeah. So we'll make it short since this is not the focus of our today's webinar, but we still want to mention it. So there are some changes to CBAM and taxonomy in the omnibus. So let's start with CBAM. Harald already mentioned it. We have a new de minimis threshold, meaning that companies that import goods that do not exceed 50 net tons, they are out of the scope of CBAM, and this reduces the companies falling under the CBAM regulation a lot. Then we have some simplifications, for example, in calculating embedded emissions. So far, it was allowed to use certain standard values instead of calculating them individually. And those due to the omnibus, it's a little bit easier to use those standard values, but still it is not allowed in any cases, but there is some simplification with regard to calculating emissions. Then we have a possibility to delegate CBAM obligations to a regular representative. That's also new, and again something that probably makes it easier for companies because they are allowed to use a representative, and this makes it easier for them to comply with their obligations under CBAM. Under taxonomy, we want to mention two changes on the next slide. This is a materiality threshold, so companies do not have to assess the taxonomy eligibility and alignment for certain economic activities if they do not exceed 10% of the total turnover of the company. This is something new to the EU taxonomy regulation. And then we also have a reduction of data points, less reporting templates that have to be filled out, which in the end leads to a reduction of data points by almost 70%. So those are the simplifications and changes we at least wanted to mention shortly.
Mm-hmm. Then moving on to the CSRD. So looking at the CSRD, before Omnibus, companies were required to collect and report sustainability data across their entire value chain, which also required them to gather information throughout the value chain. This could be carbon footprint data, but this could also be data related to some of the social topics. After the Omnibus, as part of, let's say, the effort to relieve some of this reporting burden from the SMEs, the companies in the value chain that are not subject to CSRD, so those with fewer than 1,000 employees, do now have to only provide information as is outlined in the voluntary standard for these out-of-scope companies. This is actually in alignment with the voluntary sustainability reporting standard. So this lays out data points for SMEs that can be a reduced set of data points that SMEs can report. And these are also here the data points that companies will now be able to collect from these types of companies throughout the value chain. In general, this is, from our perspective, quite a far-reaching change, because it really changes the way information is gathered throughout the value chain. And companies now need to differentiate which types of business partners they interact with. Are they subject to CSRD, or do they have less than 1,000 employees? So the efforts to gather data from them need to be in consideration of that. Sebastian, also some other changes on the CSRD?
Yeah, so one other change to the CSRD is the sector-specific standards that were planned under the current CSRD. This requirement for sector-specific standards has been removed. We are of the opinion that this is a significant change, but not a far-reaching change, because so far those sector-specific standards have not been released yet. So we don't know anyway whether they would have clarified or added value or not. So right now, this is something that changes, of course, but something that we do not really know basically the effect of.
Mm-hmm.
Taxonomy, we already talked about taxonomy. One of the changes we haven't mentioned yet, because we wanted to mention it in the context of CSRD. So before the omnibus, all the companies under the CSRD were also required to report on EU taxonomy alignment, and now after the omnibus, this has changed, or will probably change. So we have companies with more than 1,000 employees and up to 450 million turnover. They are no longer obliged to report on EU taxonomy, and only the companies with more than 1,000 employees and more than 450 million turnovers are still obliged to report under the EU taxonomy. So we have a reduction in the scope, yeah, again, also a significant change in our perspective. The data points to be reported. So far, there are more than 1,000 data points in the first set of ESRS, qualitative and quantitative ones. And this number of data points should be reduced. This may be a far-reaching change in the future. However, we still only thought of it as a significant change so far, because we don't know how many data points are removed. So this is not clear after the omnibus yet, whether a lot of data points will be removed or changed, or whether these are minor changes, but again, also something that can be probably could have a large impact on the obligations for companies.
So these actually are the major changes on the CSRD that we prepared. There were a few minor changes, such as the assurance standards, which have now moved to limited assurance only, and a few other minor changes. But maybe, Greta, to get you back into the mix, what do you comment, or what's your comment on the CSRD changes? Also, I think something that we talked about regularly are still the varying definitions between CSRD and CSDDD on chain of activities versus value chain. Is that something that the Parliament might still pick up, or yeah, how do you see that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So overall, of course, these changes were motivated by an overall discussion in the European Union about competitiveness and the fact that bureaucratic burden has been seen as a key hindrance to competitiveness in the EU. And so when picking out taxonomy, CSRD and CSDDD, originally, I think, again, this was seen as like the overarching framework. And I think it's no secret that we would have liked to see a bit more alignment. I also see a lot of questions or also concerns in the Q&A about the point that was already raised, that there's no alignment with deforestation and so on. This is certainly something that we should still try to achieve. We also have done an assessment with companies that gave us feedback over what is actually needed to reduce the administrative burden. And here it was always quite clear that the taxonomy is a very useful tool in itself, but the reporting of it has often been seen as not usable. There's no usability of the reporting of the taxonomy because nobody really asks for that kind of information. And I guess that the Commission has received the same feedback, because that's why they now say for certain companies this should be made voluntary. Then when you look at the CSRD, it's often been said that there is usability, of course, of having data comparability in the CSRD, but the amount of data points should be reduced, which is now also something that has been achieved. And then when you look at due diligence, the situation, I mean, we will still get to that, but the situation is a bit more complicated because this is a law that has not been implemented yet, and we're going from experience from the German Supply Chain Act mostly. When it comes to alignment, I do still see some points that could be aligned further between the CSRD and the CSDDD. So as you mentioned, for instance, the value chain definition. So the CSRD talks about the value chain, but there is no definition of it as such. There are ESRS guidelines over the value chain, but there is no definition as such, while the due diligence directive talks about a chain of activities, which has a very clear definition or a very specific one, but those things are not aligned. Then across all three big legislative proposals, so taxonomy, CSRD and CSDDD, you have a reference to transition plans. I'm not sure this is even listed now in the presentation, but the transition plans, for instance, remain unaligned across all three, and there are even further transition plans that have been passed in the last mandate of the Commission that are not aligned. And so I think there is still room to have better alignment across supply chain legislation as such. There was also in the chat the question whether the Parliament can still make further changes. Yes, the Parliament can make any change to any article of the CSRD or the CSDDD as such, actually. So there will still be a lot of discussion around the contents.
Since we talked now about everything that changed, I think one important thing that was rumored to might be changed, but then end up not be included, is the double materiality assessment. So the rumor was, or the let's say talk was, that only the financial materiality might remain, which was also the previous principle in the NFRD. And the CSRD then added the impact materiality, similar to the way that the GRI, for instance, does, so this double materiality approach. But in this omnibus proposal, the double materiality approach is still in place. So also the impact materiality is still in place. And we will now get to, let's say, some of the changes in the CSDDD, but we need to remember that the CSRD has still a full value chain coverage, and also on the impact materiality side. So scoping these material impacts in the value chain, gathering data from the value chain, that's still part of the CSRD. And we also have prepared a slide later, which actually shows that many companies are actively that are already reporting under the CSRD are actively reporting also material impacts in the value chain. So yeah, these things are connected, but the double materiality assessment is unchanged and remains in the CSRD for now. So moving on to the CSDDD, and we want to start here before going into all of the changes on civil liability and monitoring and so on. Start off with a deep dive on the risk assessment, because these really touch some of the core principles also of the CSDDD. And before we do that, I want to start with 2 slides of a bit of theoretical explanation of how the risk assessment under the CSDDD is structured. So here on the bottom left, you see actually a screenshot from the CSDDD Article 8, and the risk assessment, as it's also laid out in the CSDDD legal text, breaks down into 2 parts. So 2A is the risk mapping. So companies need to map their own operations, subsidiaries, and they're related to the chain of activities, those of the business partner, in order to identify general areas where adverse impacts are likely to be severe. And this is, let's say, in the risk-based approach and the concept that we at Prewave are also employing, the first step. We don't call it risk mapping, we call it scoping, because that's the term the OECD guidelines use. But the idea is really the same. It's the step where we are starting to identify these general areas of risk. And that is a process that does not happen on the individual business partner level, but we're rather looking at categories and countries here. This is a slide some of you might have already seen before. So this scoping is really a broad decision on, do I consider legal services in Germany that I'm procuring as a general area of risk in the tier 1 or in the value chain that's behind it? I think we can safely say no. Do I consider batteries that I'm procuring from Vietnam as a general area of risk, both for the facility in Vietnam and the supply chain behind it, so the cobalt and the raw materials? Here we could come to the conclusion probably yes. So both the value chain, but also the direct business partner would be in scope. And in scope then would mean that they would be considered then for the in-depth assessment. And this is sort of the second step here, the 2B step, where then companies, based on the results of the mapping that was done previously, companies are supposed to carry out in-depth assessments. And these in-depth assessments, these could be questionnaires, this could be then any type of risk assessment that works on the individual supplier level in order to identify risk suppliers or high-risk suppliers out of that we would then prioritize for mitigation and action. And this is really aligned with the approach in the OECD due diligence guidelines. And we wanted to explain this here first, these 2 different steps of the risk mapping scoping 2A and the in-depth assessment 2B, because the changes are now actually applying to either the first step or the second step of this process. And with that, I would like to hand over to Sebastian to now explain the 2 key changes to the risk mapping and to the in-depth assessments.
Yeah, so a lot of you probably have looked on LinkedIn about the news, what brings Omnibus to CSDDD. And what you can read there appears to be a little bit different than what you can read in the actual text of the CSDDD. And right now, it is not 100% clear whether this is due to an ambiguous wording or whether the changes were really meant that way. Why is that? So as Harald already mentioned, we have 2 different steps, the mapping and then an in-depth assessment. And when we start with the mapping, that's the first step. So far, before the Omnibus, there was no restriction on gathering information from business partners. Now, after the Omnibus, it's written there that no gathering of information from direct business partners with fewer than 500 employees shall take place. However, it is only mentioned in the context of risk mapping, this gathering information of small companies. This would mean that if you ask companies with less than 500 employees during the in-depth assessment, so the second step, this still remains possible. So only on the mapping level, on the first level, you would not be allowed to ask basically all your companies, all your suppliers to fill out questionnaires or ask very similar questions. This would also be in line with what the BAFA under the German Supply Chain Act published so far in their handouts, also to basically advise to take a risk-based approach. So this is the first uncertainty, because it's not 100% clear whether this gathering of information only refers to risk mapping or also to the second step, in-depth assessment. Then when we go to the second step, the in-depth assessment, then so far before the omnibus, this could have taken place in your own business operations, at your direct suppliers and indirect suppliers. And now after omnibus, the idea is that this still takes place in your own operations and direct business partners, but not on the level of indirect business partners, only in exceptional cases, only in cases of plausible information that suggest that adverse impacts have arisen or may arise. So this sounds very similar to the substantiated knowledge in the German Supply Chain Act. We will get to that, whether it's the same or different. But it basically says that the tier N in-depth assessment should not take place in any case, but just some cases, the ones where you have plausible information. And again, the question is whether this was actually wanted, because what would happen after the omnibus? You would do a risk mapping, the first step, for your deeper supply chain. For example, you qualify a certain category in a certain country as a area where adverse risks are likely and severe. And then in the second step, you would basically just concentrate on the tier 1 level. So you, in the first step, probably focused on something that rather takes place in your deeper supply chain, but then in the second step, you just look at the tier 1 level. So that's basically the question. Is that basically the steps you should take, or is there some uncertainties in the wording, and this will be changed, for example, that also the risk mapping shall only take place on the tier 1 level and not even that it's not even mandatory to look at your deeper supply chain. So as you can see, there are some uncertainties right now. The tier N approach remains at the risk mapping level, and the focus on direct business partners remains in, or is basically introduced to the in-depth assessment.
Should we go to the next slide, Sebastian? This one?
Yeah. So yeah, that's basically what I already explained. Information gathering, not for businesses, partners with fewer than 500 employees on the mapping level, but it would be okay for the in-depth assessment. The inclusion of indirect business partners on the tier N level would be okay or should take place on the risk mapping level, but not on the in-depth assessment level. Except you have plausible information. And I've already seen questions in the chat. What does plausible information mean? Nobody knows, but I think, Harald, you have some ideas.
So plausible information. Of course, at this point, we do not yet have concrete guidance, but let's say this is a term, and maybe also Greta, you can jump in here, because this term plausible information and the way it's been worded is very close now to a phrasing we also see in the German Supply Chain Act. So maybe Greta, you can also shed some light. Was this maybe also the intention from your perspective of trying to align the CSDDD here more closely with the German Supply Chain Act?
I think that is indeed the case, because again, we have like the due diligence changes are not based on experience, because the due diligence has not been implemented. But of course, there is a lot of experience from the German Supply Chain Act. So I assume that this approach to limit it to direct suppliers and then have a different mechanism for indirect business partners has to do with the fact that it's the German Supply Chain Act. On plausible information, I think that you can assume that this is also intended to be similar to substantiated concerns, or the terms that are used in the German Supply Chain Act, but it still has to, we have to remain, have to see how the Commission actually clarifies that. This has not been answered yet. And I also see a lot of questions on like timeline and so on, whether we can assume that these changes are going to be final. Any Commission changes that we're presenting right now are not necessarily final changes. It's first going to be a rather long process of the Parliament negotiating, then the Council negotiating, and then all three institutions negotiating together. And we don't know how long that will actually take. So this is not in any form the final proposal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe going back to this one, would also like to hear your perspective, Greta. I can maybe say a few words of practical implementation, but also maybe interpretation. So the information gathering being restricted here purely on the risk mapping side to 500 employees, it does seem maybe on the surface as that might not make sense. Why only restricted on that part? But in effect, this is actually been a point that also the BAFA, so the German enforcement agency, has been quite strongly emphasizing in recent guidance and recent FAQs, in that the in-depth assessment, which are often as surveys or questionnaires, they should not be sent to suppliers that are not at risk. So in another way, phrased in another way, it should not, it's not right to use kind of a broad-based questionnaire or information gathering approach for this initial step of risk mapping or scoping. This is precisely this undifferentiated approach for due diligence, which causes a lot of effort on the supplier side, and unnecessary effort, because we are asking suppliers who are maybe obviously not at risk for the same information than a supplier who is obviously at risk. So from my perspective, let's say this information gathering here in this risk mapping scoping part, really you should never do it by asking your suppliers. Like, this is what the risk scoring system is for. So this is what we also do at Prewave, is to give you an initial scoring for your direct business and indirect business partners and these general areas of risk, essentially. This is what we call the scoping. If you then have identified here a risk supplier based on an abstract approach, then it's actually okay to send them an assessment if there's a risk. So that would be my interpretation of this. So it's actually quite in line with these recent efforts to remove the burden from SME suppliers.
Yes, I think that was indeed the intention. This is also how we originally negotiated the due diligence directive. I think it's just tricky to put it. It always has been tricky and will remain tricky to put an obligation of means into law. And I think that any changes here were made with the intention to clarify what companies actually need to do, because it's often been perceived as with an entire value chain approach that you should send questionnaires to everyone, that you should know every single risk in your entire supply chain. And this is not the intention of this law, and will continue not to be the intention of this law. And yeah, as the intention of mapping is exactly like you said, not to send questionnaires, but to just be aware of where risks in your supply chain could occur. And then based on that, you were supposed to identify most severe and most likely impacts. And then there was a level which also I think remains to be, that needs to some more clarification, which is the level of involvement with your impact, which means did you have the responsibility for that risk, or did it happen somewhere in your supply chain? And I think that these approaches to have a direct business relationship and an indirect business relationship dealt with differently are also actions in order to ensure that companies are aware that it's also about your level of involvement with that risk, rather than having to deal with every risk in the same manner.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And then maybe my comment on the inclusion of the indirect business partners being, let's say, still required for the mapping part, but then only in case of plausible information for the in-depth assessment part, like maybe also giving the benefit of the doubt, how can this make sense? That the risk mapping and scoping part is actually a very similar process and should be an integrated process to what's also needed for the impact materiality of the CSRD. And that also includes the value chain. And many companies today are actually reporting on these impacts that they see as material in their value chains. And this is again a kind of a risk mapping or scoping approach here. And to then, let's say, go deeper on the business partner level, so really going into the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, based on plausible information that there's really, let's say, risks also to be observed based on an additional information standard. And here we have prepared this slide. So what could that be, this plausible information? And this is also drawing on, of course, some of the experiences from the German Supply Chain Act, where the term is not plausible information, but substantiated knowledge. But the concept is quite similar. So this could be grievance reports. So if your company receives through the official grievance channel reports about potential impacts in the deeper supply chain, then that can constitute plausible information. So in these cases, you would have to look deeper. Also media reports, news reports or investigative journalism that is uncovering certain conditions in supply chains can constitute that. In addition, any kind of government or NGO reports. I have highlighted here some recent examples. This would be the Amazon leather report from 2021, which linked some companies to deforestation in Brazil and in the Amazon. Then in the middle here, we have a report from Senator Wyden in the US on Uyghur forced labor and how companies are addressing that, also giving quite specific supply chain information. And here, for instance, a report on child labor in the mica mining in Madagascar. So these could be specific such indications that constitute plausible information. Of course, there are also other regulations which are in force, which also require companies to build up transparency into the supply chain. And if you have this supply chain information and you gather risks out of these other legislative efforts and due diligence efforts, that might again lead to plausible information that you consider under the CSDDD. And the last point I want to make is actually one that's a bit, let's say, less clear, but it's just one that I also want to bring, is that the CSRD and the impact materiality assessment does cover the value chain. And I've prepared here a report from the Sustainability Reporting Navigator. So we will add the source here. This is really a great website and resource that is aggregating CSRD reports that are available. We have here companies like Airbus, Carlsberg, and others. And we can see, for instance, here how many of them have some material topics listed in the report on, for instance, workers in the value chain. So again, if here, as part of the materiality analysis, a company comes to the conclusion, I have material risks or impacts in the value chain, then again, how can this, or this should be potentially then based on plausible information that there are such material impacts. So again, these topics are potentially connected. And with that, I want to hand back to Sebastian to give us an overview of the other important changes to the CSDDD.
Yeah, so one of the other far-reaching changes is the civil liability. So far, the civil liability was possible under certain circumstances, only in case of an intentional or negligent behavior, non-compliance with preventive or remedial measures, and a causality between the damage and the company's misconduct. This civil liability clause would be deleted after Omnibus, and civil liability only remains possible under national laws. The most interesting fact about the deletion is that also the international mandatory application has been deleted. This internationally mandatory application would have led to the application of the CSDDD and the civil liability in cases where the harm occurred in a third country, a non-EU country, because then the CSDDD and the civil liability would have been applied mandatorily. And with this deletion, it is most likely that if a certain violation takes place in a third country, non-EU country, that the law of that country applies, meaning no CSDDD and no civil liability clause of the CSDDD. So in that case, in those cases, it depends on whether this respective law has any civil liability for cases of violations of due diligence obligations. So this is the most severe change in my perspective. Another change, of course, is that the civil liability clause is not explicitly mentioned anymore in the CSDDD, and it depends on the national laws. And in some national law, under some national laws, it is probably less likely that a company would be liable, but still it's not entirely excluded. So it's a little bit different than under the German Supply Chain Act, where you can find an explicit sentence that the violation of a due diligence obligation does not give rise to any liability under civil law. So we don't have a comparable sentence in the new Omnibus CSDDD. So there might be still a liability under national civil law, but as I mentioned before, the more severe aspect is that this international mandatory application has been deleted, and this would in the end lead to a law of a third country in most of the cases.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Greta, quickly your comment on this. I mean, this has been something that's been debated quite heavily and really been a big concern of many companies. What is your view on the changes here to the civil liability in CSDDD?
Yes, so I think on the civil liability, there is still a lot of discussion on what is actually in the text of the CSDDD regarding civil liability. And as Sebastian also just now explained, originally, of course, the civil liability does not establish, the CSDDD doesn't establish civil liability in itself. It still was up to member states in any case, but it set certain conditions that member states should stick to. And so that was part of a harmonizing aspect, so to say, and this harmonizing aspect, in my view, is now missing. And the main far-reaching change that I see here is indeed the deletion of the mandatory overriding application, which limits the access to justice for actual victims. So I think that a certain amount of impact of this law is now being deleted because victims outside the European Union can no longer claim any damages before an EU court. So this is indeed, I think, the two most far-reaching proposals in this omnibus are regarding the identification of impacts in the supply chain, that we earlier discussed and this liability change.
Okay, thank you. All right, Sebastian, then there's a few other changes.
Some other changes that we do not consider far-reaching, but still significant. One of those is the penalty clause. So far, the maximum fine was at least 5% of the annual turnover. After Omnibus, there are no more figures included in the text, so the penalties would be up to the member states. Again, we included the reference of the German Supply Chain Act with a maximum fine of 2% of the turnover. Of course, the change is not only a minor one, a significant one, but still it cannot be foreseen how the member states will decide on the penalties. So they could still opt in favor of a penalty of at least 5% of the turnover. Now you could claim, well, a member state could also decide for a penalty of just €1. But in this regard, the Commission issues guidance, and already in the text of the CSDDD, it is written that the penalties of the member state have to be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So it's basically not entirely in the discretion of a member state to decide on the exact numbers of the penalty. Then we have a change in the monitoring paragraph. So the monitoring article so far said that monitoring, meaning assessing the adequacy and effectiveness of your measures, has to be carried out at least every 12 months. Now, after the Omnibus, that would be 5 years. Again, that's something that you can read differently on LinkedIn, because sometimes it's written that the entire due diligence would only need to be carried out every 5 years. That is not correct. So it is the monitoring that has to be carried out at least every 5 years. And also in cases where basically where you have new risks, we would consider this as a minor change, maybe a significant change, but more a minor change, because so far most companies do not have sophisticated monitoring systems. Yeah, they decide to use some individual monitoring KPI, for example, how many complaints you received or how many employees you have trained. And whether you do this once per year or every 5 years, at least what we can see so far wouldn't make a big of a difference.
Greta, can you also confirm this interpretation that these, let's say, changes to the monitoring period are purely for this monitoring the effectiveness of the implementation and not the risk analysis and all of that part of it?
Yes, so of course, also for me, it's often difficult to interpret the changes that the Commission has made, and I'm careful to confirm anything. But earlier today, I got the confirmation from the Commission that indeed this is regarding the effectiveness of the measures that you have taken, and it's not about the entire risk analysis, for instance.
Okay. Thank you. All right, moving on. Another debate.
Yes, another aspect we would consider as a minor change. So far, a last resort among the preventive and the remedial measures was to terminate a business relationship with the supplier. This termination of the business relationship was deleted. So now only suspensions or non-entering into new relations and not extending an existing relationship with a supplier is required, but not the termination. So, of course, this could lead to the situation that a company could continue to work with a supplier that is not improving, but is continuing without terminating the relationship, because the company wouldn't be obliged to do that with this deletion. But in practice, we can often see a different approach. It is more likely that a company even terminates the business relationship at a much earlier point in time, because the company doesn't want to think about far-reaching preventive and remedial measures and the costs and efforts related to them. If they have alternative suppliers, if they have other options, just want to terminate the relationship. So, and they still can do that. They are just not obliged to do this anymore after the omnibus proposal. So in practice, I think this will not change a lot.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree with this assessment, Greta, that this is a minor change, even though I think the business community is quite adamant about this change?
I think when we already discussed this, the problem with termination of contracts is also something that is not entirely reflected in the international standards. So the OECD, for instance, the framework never actually talks about the obligation to terminate a business relationship, because in the end, due diligence is about best efforts in order to make sure that certain risks are mitigated rather than the so-called cut and run. And so when this was passed, I think what they had in mind was mostly forced labor. So that you have to terminate your business relationships in very severe cases of very severe infringements of human rights, including forced labor and child labor, that in such areas companies should no longer operate. The forced labor regulation has passed, so there is already an abolition of forced labor included products in the EU. And so I think that this is no longer relevant. And indeed, I think that as such, within due diligence, the obligation to terminate, therefore, is not a significant change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Financial institutions.
Financial institutions. So before the omnibus, the CSDDD included a clause that it will be reviewed in the future whether it makes sense to include also not only the upstream sourcing of financial institutions, but also the deposits, loans, investments, downstream, the downstream supply chain of financial institutions. So this review clause has been deleted. So this means that it will stay as it is, and only the upstream sourcing of financial institutions are included in the CSDDD. And also in the future, there will be no change to that. We think it's a minor change because also with this review clause, it wasn't 100% clear or certain, or couldn't be sure that in the future financial institutions would be covered more broadly. And also with the review clause, there was a high probability that also in the future everything remains as it is. Mm-hmm. So not a big change. Stakeholder engagement, also not a huge change. There is still stakeholder engagement, also something that was published on LinkedIn a lot, that there will be no real stakeholder engagement anymore because of Omnibus. This is not reflected in the text of the Omnibus. When you look at the wording, you can see that there is still engagement required with employees, with workers in the supply chain, and so on. There are just some of those groups that were deleted, like customers, like human rights and environmental institutions, civil society organizations, but still most of these groups remain in the text. So stakeholder engagement will be also a very new field for companies under the omnibus, because so far most companies are not doing a lot in that regard. And even with an omnibus CSDDD, they will need to improve their actions, their stakeholder engagement actions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then the transition plan.
Transition plan, that's good. I think we haven't discussed this before our webinar, Greta. I don't know. I just realized with Harald that we forgot to talk about this. And this is something where I personally do not see a lot of differences, because the only word that was deleted is put into effect. So you still need a transition plan. You need to adopt it, but you do not have to put it in effect. But I don't see a huge change, because already so far you could basically comply with the obligation to have a transition plan by just implementing the CSRD. And also so far, according to Article 25, authorities were only empowered to supervise the adoption of the transition plan and not how it was put into effect. So I do not see a huge change in that regard, but maybe you have something to add.
So you already summarized it perfectly. The only thing that happened is that put into effect was replaced by implementing actions. And I personally also don't know what the difference is. So this is something that the Commission still has to answer for.
All right. And then the last one, the level of harmonization.
Yeah, level of harmonization. So so far, full harmonization, so that the member states cannot deviate from the provisions with respect to risk assessment, preventive and remedial measures. And this was extended to the due diligence support at a group level, so that a parent company is allowed to conduct due diligence also for subsidiaries and for the complaints mechanism in Article 14. So there are basically just some two more due diligence or two more aspects added to the level of harmonization. But from my perspective, a minor change, since the most interesting aspects, risk assessment, preventive and remedial measures, were already fully harmonized before.
Mm-hmm. All right. Q&A, I think we are already close to 10 minutes over and answered already 32 questions in writing. I'm not sure, Sebastian, Greta, if you still see any questions that you have to answer.
Maybe one which I don't know the answer to, but I've seen it a couple of times in the chat. What happens to the German Supply Chain Act? Well, that's also that's the other $1 million question beside the what should I do under the CSRD? What should I do under the German Supply Chain Act? So far, I can only say continue, because the BAFA, the LKSG is still in place. The BAFA is still sending questionnaires. The BAFA is still working. There might be a different development. There might be that the German Supply Chain Act will be abolished in the near future. Maybe not. We don't know, at least, and that's why you should for the moment continue. Also, because of another aspect, a lot of companies were already thinking about basically not publishing a LKSG report anymore, but replacing this report through the CSRD report. But if CSRD will now be postponed and LKSG still applies, then you would need to have a separate LKSG report ready by the end of the year. That's at least the deadline for now. This is also something you should have in mind. So uncertainties with the LKSG, but for the moment, everything stays as it is.
And I think for my part, the most asked question is really, when is the omnibus coming? When is it finalized? When is it voted? Here again, it's very difficult for us to say that. I think that there are two parts to it. One is the postponement of the deadlines. This is something that can be dealt with quite quickly. There are so-called fast-track procedures for this kind of type of legislation, which were also used mostly during COVID, for instance, where things can move a bit quicker. But for all of the other changes that we presented today, these require very intensive negotiations, because essentially we are reopening the entire CSRD and the entire CSDDD. So it will take a couple of weeks until this proposal is referred to the Parliament. Then the rapporteurs have to be negotiated, and then afterwards we have a period for amendments, and I expect a lot of amendments for the due diligence, for instance, alone. We had 2,000 amendments back when we started the procedure in the Parliament. You can double that when you look at the CSRD. And basically at this point, anything can happen content-wise, and therefore also time-wise. There's absolutely no certainty when this is going to happen. Negotiations take months, sometimes years. And this is part of why this postponement was actually suggested, in order to give companies time and not have unlimited legal uncertainty while we negotiate. But there is no one that can tell you when this will actually be voted.
All right. Well, thank you for your insights, Greta and Sebastian. We hope that there were potentially also some new perspectives and new views here in this webinar for you today. Again, I want to thank you, Greta and Sebastian, for joining me today. And
thank you, Harald.
Yeah, the Omnibus package certainly simplified things, but there's still a lot to talk about, and the fundamental principles are still in place. The CSRD, CSDDD, and taxonomy are still in place, and yeah, we will keep you updated with any further changes. So yeah, thank you guys, and until the next webinar.
Thanks everyone. Bye bye.